are also associated with less original forms of remixing. So I want to sort of wrap things up by going back to some sort of implications for advocacy, because fundamentally, that's sort of how I see myself as an advocate for free software and for peer production more broadly. This is sort of what I think of as the old model. I've heard this described as the Paleo-Raymondist model. So this is a reference to Eric Raymond and the Cathedral and the Bazaar, right? The idea was, I think a lot of people sort of went into, like 1998, there were a lot of people going into the free software world with this idea that if you took your code and you published it openly, that a community would show up and start fixing your bugs and improving your software, and that you would end up with this stuff, which was high quality. According to the open source, if you go to opensource.org, you look at their mission statement, it says open source is a development methodology that leads to higher quality, which has the promise of higher quality, higher reliability, I forget, like a whole, like great stuff and profit, right? That's not in the mission statement, but that's the other missing piece here. This is the promise of open source, right? And the promise of like releasing stuff freely. This is what peer production, the reason we're interested in peer production in these big communities is because we believe that when we have these big communities of people coming in and fixing our bugs, that the process of that work will be this stuff, which is really high quality. Inherently like high quality. Better quality than the proprietary alternatives who have less people working in their companies than we have out in the world willing to volunteer on our projects, right? So I hope I've convinced you that we're missing an important piece here, right? That there's this bit about attracting a community. I once gave a related talk on free software. It was called Why Free Software, it was originally called Why Free Software Sucks or something, or Why Free Software Isn't Better, or When Free Software Isn't Better, that's right. And someone came up to me afterwards, after basically seeing all those sort of those graphs, and was like, that was really depressing, man. Where's the good news, right? Which sort of struck me because, for me at least, I'm very optimistic because I don't see all those failed Wikipedias or unremixed projects or failed software projects as something to be sad about, right? I mean, if you go and you talk to the people that have released these projects and never got remixed, are they upset? No, not really. If you go and talk to people on SourceForge that never had anyone come and contribute to their project, are you upset? Well, I mean, it would have been nice, but like, I'm not that upset because failure is reasonably cheap here. I'm just throwing stuff on there. It's I've written the software anyway. I love the idea of other people contributing to it. But I also am excited, not just because they're not so bad, but because I think that they're real opportunities to learn and improve our understanding and to improve the practice of peer production, the practice of free software development, the practice of making wikis, the practice of remixing. I feel strongly, as perhaps you've already gained about many things, but one thing I feel strongly about is dividing the world into sort of empirical statements and principled statements. And I think it benefits our community to remain very focused on the difference between these two. I don't think we should make a part of our advocacy saying that if you publish your stuff openly, you will end up with stuff that's higher quality because the community will come and improve it, because that's demonstrably untrue in the vast majority of cases. Is peer production better in terms of quality? Sometimes, yes, clearly, right? And in some ways, probably. And in many ways, and in many other situations, probably not. But there are other principled ways in which peer production is always better, right? Free culture always empowers people to transcend their roles as creators, to become producers. To really sort of take control. And that, in my opinion, is one of the important and potentially one of the most important, and this idea that that all of these projects that I've shown you, like wikis, software, free software, remixing, all of these projects are encouraging people to transcend their role just as the sort of producers of information and really become involved in production. And I think that is an important and potentially transformative process, even if people don't usually take advantage of it. And through this process, peer producers are changing the world and making things better. But only when we manage to get over to the other side of this graph, these few successful projects. And in that sense, advocacy that takes this for granted or tries to sweep it under the rug may actually hurt our movement. So peer production isn't always better. It isn't always more successful. But it's our responsibility as principled advocates and as good researchers and as practitioners in these projects to understand why. If we can understand why, the why, right? And when peer production isn't better, and when it is, we'll be able to spread the essential freedoms that peer production allows. So I hope you join me in that project. That is what I've prepared.
So,
All right.
excellent.
I'd love to talk to people, I'm sure people
Try
are.
to do a little free discussion and.
Let's do it.
Okay, go ahead.
So projects that are happening and stuff out there in the world that are for some definition of, at a level of success or failure, what are you seeing? What kind of projects are you seeing people working on that are open source, that are becoming successful? The new up and coming kids.
Incoming kids. Yeah, I mean, if I knew, right? I mean, I think that one thing that's been interesting is that I think that so in free culture projects, it's very production is very focused on the kinds of things that people like and want to do, right? So if you look at wikis, a huge proportion of the activity that goes on is what I might sort of put in the category of like fan culture, right? Entertainment, games, sports, right? Huge amounts of stuff going on in there. It's just enormous. And even if you look at within Wikipedia, you see that. And some people get mad because they're like, you know, look at the article on Iron Man. It has 15,000 words. If you look at the article on 16th century philosophy, there are 60 words, right? That's horrible, right? And I'm like, okay, let's look at the number of viewers to the articles on Iron Man and the articles on 16th century philosophy. In fact, there are more viewers per word. Like the Iron Man article is underproduced along this metric, right? Compared to the 16th century philosophy article. Because although there are only 61 words in the 16th century philosophy article, no one's reading it. Whereas everyone's reading Iron Man, and it's being really systematically underproduced, right? So I think that when you look at big successful wikis, you see an enormous amount of fan culture. I was shocked by how much work is there. In terms of software, I mean, I don't know, all kinds of stuff. I guess if I knew where things were sort of going, I mean, like there's lots of things that there's lots of types of software development. It's like tons of like web applications in places that I would have thought they would. That's not how I would have gone about solving the problem. Tons of mobile applications, which of course didn't really exist in a major way a short period of time, and lots of free tools. There's a little like for Android, there's an app store which is called F-Droid, which is it's like an app store kind of only for free software. It has a nice little like Android wearing like a Richard Stallman beard because it's a little icon. But it's a cute little thing. But there's just tons of stuff out there, right? And big communities of people producing it. So I don't know. I mean, if other people have ideas, I'd love to hear as well. Yeah.
Okay, so if there's a fanatic fan base for something, anything, then it's more likely that a project that's related to that
Yeah.
is going to succeed.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, I think so. But what's interesting is that very often there's this idea that like you don't always just not everyone's a potential contributor and not everyone's a potential good contributor. So a great example of this would be that very often when you're starting a free software project, you know, you don't necessarily want contributions from absolutely everyone, right? You want contributions from people who can make good contributions. Bugs are like a great example of this, right? So you want to file a bug against Debian, right? Debian has a bug tracking system at bugs.debian.org, but you cannot file a bug in Debian using the web, right? And it's not because no one has thought about it. They've decided to make it impossible for you to file a bug in the web, and this has been free for forever, right? You have to initially you had to write specially crafted email with an RFC 822 pseudo header, which included information about how to do it. There's now programs which you can run in Debian to file a bug, right? But the result is because Debian doesn't want bug reports from everybody, right? They want bug reports from people that know how to file good, reproducible bugs, right? And that actually just allowing anyone to contribute a bug report may result in lots of people who don't really have bug reports. They don't understand how to file a good one. And if people are filing bad bug reports that are not reproducible, you're not going to be able to fix them, right? You're probably going to have to close them as unreproducible, which will annoy the person who filed the bug report because you're not fixing their bug, right? And so they made the decision that, in Ubuntu, we made it relatively much more open, and I don't know what the official line is, but I'll tell you personally, I think it was a disaster. There were the vast majority of bugs in Ubuntu, at least when I was involved, were never looked at, and they were never looked at because people couldn't keep up with them, right?
And they spent a huge amount of time and effort trying to look at bugs, most of which are a waste of time to look at.
Right. Debian. I would say that I once did this when I last looked. I looked. 25% of bugs ever filed against my packages in Debian have included a patch or had one uploaded by someone else. 25%. That's unbelievable compared to Ubuntu, right? And compared to many other projects, right? But it's because they've created barriers which sort of select for certain types of people and not others, right? So it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, there's a tension between this idea of, like, we can want to involve lots of people in production because we think it's a good thing, right? And I think that that's true, right? I think that you know, like, one thing, the reason I'm excited about free software and free culture is because for me, like, it's this idea that like, if I had a phone, I dropped my phone and broke it last week, but if I had a phone, and I wanted to send a message to, I don't know, like, my friends, my mother in Seattle, I'd be constrained by the features on the phone, right? If I can only send text messages, I can, I can write maybe a nice short message, right? But I'm going to be constrained. If I can have a voice call, I can sing, I can send intonation, I can send a very different type of message. If I can take a picture, I can send a very different kind of message, right? The point here is that the technology in my phone is going to really determine in important ways the nature of what I can say, who I can say it to, how I can say it, right? The question of who controls that technology is the question of who controls some part of my experience. And to the extent that my experience of the world is increasingly mediated by technology, and I don't know about you, but my experience of the world and people around me is increasingly mediated by technology. The question of who controls that technology is an enormously important political question. And so it's important that this stuff be free. Not because it's going to be high quality, but because it's important that I be able to determine how that technology uses. The question of who controls my technology, for all the reasons I've just explained, like, is the question of who controls my experience. And the answer, the free software answer is you, users. You should control your technology. The question of Wikipedia, right? Who controls the reference, the contents of the reference work that we all use to answer every bar bet and random question out there, right? Like, it's the question of who defines the canonical reference work that everyone uses to answer everything, right?
Well, everything true.
Everything trivia. Is an enormously important political question, right? And Wikipedia's answer is you. You can decide. Well, you can decide, and someone can fight with people over whether or not, how it works. But it's not costless. It's not necessarily efficient, but it is sort of important. And so for me, that's I don't know. That's sort of how I think about the issue. There's a question back there, and then is that okay?
Is it true that the last presidential election that the vice presidential candidate, somebody predicted based on the Wikipedia editing who it was going to be?
Well, I mean, I think that may be true, but I mean, there weren't that many options, right? So, I mean, like, probably people made every possible prediction, and then the one guy who was right talked about it. So, I take that with a grain of salt. I mean, I think that there's lots of Wikipedia is really, really good for breaking news coverage, like shockingly good. And there's a guy named Brian Keegan who was at Northwestern, now is at Northeastern University, who's done a whole bunch of work looking at breaking news coverage of Wikipedia, like the Fukushima reactor. Every time there's like a disaster, he looks at how Wikipedians deal with that. But it's incredibly good in terms of the way in which they build encyclopedic knowledge. People come in and they use the word standard. It's really like it's beautiful how it happens. That said, I mean, it's reactive, not predictive. So I don't know. I've seen stuff about like stock prices that predict stock prices. People do it with Twitter as well. You can look at all kinds of stuff, right? Yeah.
How would you compare Linus Torvald and Jimmy Wales? I mean, they both, like Linus Torvald, he came out with Linux in 1991 and just sort of released it. And what do you think?
Well, I mean, Linux. So I actually have somewhere another slide, which is exactly the same as that Wikipedia and all the proto-Wikipedias. I have one with Linux, and then the 15 previous operating systems which existed before Linux, right? And which were doing something extremely similar, like Unix-like operating systems. Like
Minix.
Like Minix. I mean, we can probably say the herd existed beforehand.
There were about a dozen, all from the universities in Europe, here, and they built it for teaching purposes, really. So that they could
Well,
teach.
but Linux was also built. Linux was built by a graduate student to teach himself operating
Yes,
systems,
yes.
right?
But the point is that there are all these independent efforts What we're missing is that they all had maybe different mindset, different motivation, and it's very hard to say that this succeeded because of this and they didn't succeed. Their vectors were different, so you can't really, try to cast a single net on all of them and say, well, they didn't succeed,
So
even
you're-
though they came
That's right.
before. One question that I did have, and that's more or less pervasive throughout all the slides, is that you're trying to take a statistical approach to understanding what worked and what didn't work, and forgive me, but trying to see what patterns are there, because then if you know the patterns, then you know what to avoid. But if you step back a little before that, one of the things we notice is that there's motivation, just the right mix of motivation of the initial crowd behind any one project. And that example would be Wikipedia. Somehow, and this is just like in nature and evolution, it tries many combinations and there's millions of failures before one species
Sure.
evolves and gets out. Here the same thing is happening,
Sure.
where they all had the right confluence coming together. There are projects like it that didn't work. And that's one thing that you might want to investigate or pull out, because that might give you that baseline fabric that would help. And the one measure, the one metric I saw was that leadership acting as a proxy for success. And that might be a sort of distillation or culmination of all those motivations of the different groups that they're converging. And that's something that you might want to go down that path.
But in terms of motivation, Nupedia and Wikipedia had the exact same motivation with
They had the same
exact
founders.
Okay, yeah,
Like Jimmy
carry
Wales
on,
started
yeah.
Bullshit.
It was the same two people created the same project at the same time.
Yes.
But are very similar projects, right?
Yes.
So the leadership wasn't necessarily different. And in fact, the one in which they practiced less leadership. Anyway, the point is, I don't disagree with your point. I think that what you said is completely correct. This is the question of how we mobilize contributors in here is one of these big, hairy questions that has many possible answers.
Yes, and
right?
that's what I'm
many
trying to
true
get
answers.
to, that the leadership is a proxy, but what really we should be looking at is all those initial contributors, the seed contributors, and their train of thought that held it up and sustained it. That's why it got past that. That's what I'm
Well, so
trying
let
to
me
allude
give-
to.
Let me give you an analogy, right? Like
Yeah.
an analogy to a similar sort of question, right? Like, what makes successful firms, right? Like firms that make money, right? Like, there's not a single answer to this question, right? We can say leadership is a proxy for a lot of things, right? We can say, go look at the motivations of consumers, right? We can say all these things, and these are all reasonable things that people do successfully, right? And but just because there's not a single answer doesn't mean that we can't learn something by comparing the successful firms and the unsuccessful firms to figure out, to come up with a set of ideas to give people that can, it won't guarantee your firm's success, right? But it can probably keep you from making some mistakes that lots of other people have made before,
True,
right?
true.
You can probably do marginally better than what's come before, right? And sometimes the results are not things which you can easily change, right? Like you do a familiar product, right? Like build the old thing. Well, what if you're not building the old thing? What if the goal of your project is to do something else? Well, then you can't change that, right? You're going to have to work on other stuff, right? But I think that if we could accomplish, if I can accomplish, 1% of, or 1% of 1% of what we've done for learning how to build successful firms, for learning how to build successful peer production projects, I think the world would be, I think that marginal improvement could be enough that it would make an important.
Well, and if you can, even if they're not exactly right, if you can create a conceptual model that has some predictability, then, and people can use that to be more successful, even if you're not right. Like, there were several different versions of how electricity worked before we got to the current version. And all of them were useful and productive, even though they weren't right.
I'll also say that the version of electricity that did work when Edison was selling electricity, he, for example, originally they dimmed the power of the lights because people were used to gas lamps, and the electric lights were too bright. And so to make them more like gas lamps, he's made fixtures for walls that looked like gas lamps. They put it in gas tubings at enormous expense so that it seemed more like gas, because people understood gas, and they understood it, and they could accept it. So it's this idea of sort of familiarity as well. So
We know that by user interface today.
So that's sort of part of the story. But I mean, what I'm trying to do is take the so I presented a couple different kinds of work here. Some which is more and I do a bunch of different types of work, right? Some work in like the Wikipedia stuff is very explorative. I'm just generating hypotheses. I don't know if those are true or not, right? The data that I have in that study suggests that it could be, but like I can't test it there, right? I have a bunch of more cross-sectional work where I take, for example, hundreds of thousands of Wikia wikis, and then try to look at those wikis in terms of those hypotheses and others. Which remixes are more successful? And then I have new work that I'm doing where I'm working directly with communities to make changes to their systems so that they launch some of them in some ways and some of them in different ways, doing real experiments in communities. And those allow us to really get at that causal sort of angle. So this is the process through which I'm trying to build this this process. So in 5 years, buy my book. It'll be great.
Your book won't be free like all the free
It'll be
software?
free, but that's why you need to buy it, to support people that release it free. No, I do. I've released every book that I've done, at least all of my contributions have been free. I don't know if this will be a difficult, convincing an academic publisher is tricky, but open access is doing good stuff. So I've published all my articles are on my website. I'm a big believer in getting this stuff out there. In part because I want you all to read them. So there was a question.
I think we got time for one more.
Is there any link in the wiki space to the concept of a benevolent dictator?
Oh yes.
One of the things that we see in open source projects is probably the overwhelming vast majority that do have that person in that role, or even if it's a very small limited community or something like Debian, where it's a small committee and a set of
Debian is not that small.
policies that fosters the success of the project.
Yeah, so you definitely do, and I have another study which I just did looking at wikis, where I look at administrators of wikis, and this is again really interesting. What you see is that you definitely see there's a small group of people who are usually present at the beginning, who basically consolidate power within the project. You have a small number of administrators who are present at the beginning. So very often, like within the first year or so, they stop adding admins. No one else becomes an admin, or very few people do. And over time, their interests actually diverge from the project, from the rest of the membership. And we can see that in a few different ways. They start reverting other members more often. You see this, you see the creation of oligarchies in these projects. But one thing that's different is that when this happens in a firm, you're just stuck with like a kind of bad boss, right? But when it happens in a project, you can fork. And in fact, you do. You've seen a whole bunch of the biggest Wikia wikis have actually forked and created new wikis. So you see that dynamic playing out. But you definitely see this product. There's a good, a lot of the successful wikis have this pattern of like strong leadership, but this strong leadership in the long term ends up creating problems. So there's this sort of catch-22 in that process. I'm happy to share that work as well. Anything that's not on my webpage, I list, you can send me an email and I'm happy to send you papers or there's talks. My webpage is I try to make it pretty comprehensive. So I encourage anyone to check it out. But I'm totally interested. If you have ideas or feedback, I'd love to do that. So I'd love to talk. So.
Attract community. I was thinking about changing from Wikipedia to back to your Scratch program. Okay, you talk about Scratch at MIT, it'll probably die. You talk about Scratch at a PTA meeting, it'll probably die. You talk about Scratch at Eastern Michigan University, which is a teacher's college, it might actually get some life.
Yeah. Well, Scratch is not just used at MIT, it's created at MIT. So it won't die there. But yeah, you're right. I think that's right. Scratch is widely used by teachers. And I mean, like, that's why there are millions of users, right? Like, but I think that's right. And I think that I would encourage all of you, it's a free software program, there's a new version on it's web-based. The old version is free software, and it's really great. So check it out. All right, well, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it.